I know it's late and we have this wonderful lunch waiting for us. So I will limit this to an hour. I also want to say that Gus is a wonderful example of that passion. And I really appreciate him sharing that with us today. And I want to repeat what I said in the greeting this morning, is that not everybody agrees on everything, clearly in our society and even in our church. So I want to emphasize the great gift of freedom of thought and freedom of belief that we share, because this is a sensitive subject and not everyone agrees, even in the church, and that's fine. That's absolutely fine. I'm going to add a couple of thoughts about young people today. It's my fascination at the moment, how young people are reacting to this issue, and particularly the kids in Florida who have really done some amazing things since they were the victims of a mass shooting in their school. It's not often that we hear from our young people in such a situation where the emotions are so intense, and yet with these young folks a serious degree of intellectual analysis is also present. I think they are speaking serious truths to us, those of us who are, most of us, adults. And I want to suggest that these young people are speaking to us almost from another dimension, another frame of reference. And I want to suggest two ways in which they're speaking from that frame of reference that is different from ours. As Delaney Tarr says, our biggest flaws, our tendency to be a bit too aggressive, our tendency to lash out, things you would expect from a teenager, these are also our strengths. So I want to suggest that part of what we can hear in our youth is that they are not yet in the game of being an adult. They're not. They're still at a stage where they're moving into that state, but they haven't totally bought into it yet. And one of the things that happens at that stage of life is you look around you and say, do I want to be an adult? This is the way they do things. So they're not in that game yet. And that gives them a special perspective. The other thing that gives them a special perspective, I think, is that they, unlike almost all of us, are speaking out of direct experience. The kids in Florida are not thinking about what if or about ethics in the abstract. They have been in a war. They are survivors of a battle where they watched their comrades get shot and collapse and die. And so, they are not observers or pundits. They're survivors. And they have been transformed by those experiences. And so they speak to us from that transformed place, where most of us have not been. And they know things that we don't know, things we don't even want to know what that's like. So these factors, along with their endearing and appealing personal qualities, give their voices a kind of authority, which is, I think, a gift to us. And it's also a terrible responsibility, because part of their message is to tell us, the adults, that we have failed them. That's part of the message. We have failed to keep them safe. And they're telling us that and calling us out on it. We may think that these events are so far away in Florida, but something not so different happened just a week ago on the Bradley campus, where two young people were killed by a 16-year-old young person with a gun at a party. And this just brings it right to us. How did he get that gun? And what forces that we may never understand prompted him to take that action? And in another part of town on the same night, someone else was killed. So it forces us to think about what is going on. The teenagers, one of the special messages that the teenagers speak, I think, is that we cannot say that there's nothing that can be done. That's not an answer. We cannot say there's nothing we can do. First of all, things are not that hopeless. But secondly, it's not morally acceptable to say there's nothing we can do. One of the hopeful things that's happened since the Florida shootings is that some change has occurred, and some states have taken actions, including Illinois. Not giant steps, but some steps. These events prove that something can happen. Things are happening. That which is happening is possible. That which is happening is possible. And I will just say, from my own perspective, but I end up being right in the middle of American opinion on these matters. I am Mr. Ordinary this morning. On many of these issues, for example, universal background checks. The level of support for universal background checks in the United States is 90%. And it has been 90% for years. I looked at a bunch of polls. The lowest one was 84%, and the highest one was 97%. There is virtually a consensus, not quite, but 90%, that there should be universal background checks. There's majorities of both Republicans and Democrats on this, and the majority of NRA members support universal background checks. Did you know that? It's around 70%. Support that. There is a consensus in our country across the entire spectrum that we should do that. So the question I would propose then, I was going to say background checks are as popular as baseball and apple pie, but baseball is not that popular. You can't get 90% of the population to say they support baseball. I don't even know if it's 50%. But there's 90% that support universal background checks. If something in our society has a 90% support and the government doesn't implement that, it's not working. It's not happening. So something is wrong about that system, and we need to figure out what that is. What holds that up? Now, the other thing that is a little bit fascinating, but less of a consensus, is assault rifles, AR-15s, and so forth. Almost all the mass shootings have been done with these kinds of weapons. The support for banning or limiting those kinds of weapons is approximately 60% in our society, or slightly higher. That's a big majority. That's a very big majority. If somebody won the presidential election by 61%, they would carry virtually every state in the union. So we need to think about why things that the public wants aren't happening. There's also a lot of discussion of mental health resources, which is often framed as a conservative issue. I am a conservative on that. Yes, I think we need more mental health facilities. Absolutely. No question about it. So, I am all for that. I'm not for it as a substitute for the others. It's not a substitute, it's part of it. So I don't really know what combination of measures would lessen the number of gun deaths. I know that good people can disagree on these issues, just like we can disagree on everything. Disagreement is fine as long as we keep our eyes on the goal. We cannot pretend that there's nothing we can do. That's not a true statement. I also want to say that I support the importance of personal freedom that is important to many gun owners. I agree with that. I do think that personal freedom is important, and I support that thing. It's a good thing, but it's not the only good thing. And many of our most difficult problems is when there are several good things and they conflict with each other. So personal freedom is good, and saving lives is also good. So if they're in conflict with each other in some way, then we have to figure out how to balance that out. Freedom is good, but freedom is not infinite. For example, here at the church, we are free to park our cars in the parking lot. But we are not free to park our cars in the fellowship hall, or the sanctuary for that matter. Our freedoms always have limits. That's the way freedom works. We have the freedom to go out to a bar and have a few drinks and have fun with our friends, and we also have the freedom to drive. But if one consumes too much, then the freedom to drive goes away. So there's always a balance there. This is not a radical statement. This is like Civics 101. So it doesn't mean that freedom should go away, but it means that there will have to be a balance between freedom and safety. These are not radical ideas. These are absolutely mainstream American points of view. This is the most conservative I've felt in a long time. The students from Stoneman Douglas High School are speaking the truth in words that are both plain and eloquent, but as the young woman said in the reading, they're angry and they're in pain. And so when we hear them, we hear that. And we need to listen to it. They are upset that we, the adults, have not done what we are supposed to do, which is to keep them safe in those schools. So I would say we have to do something, although I don't know what the exact combination is. We just can't say that this kind of carnage is inevitable. So whether it happens in Florida or the south side of Chicago or Bradley or the south end of Peoria, and whether it happens to black or white or Latino young people or to any people anywhere, the young people are actually the prophets at this moment, calling us to moral responsibility to keep them safe. And they are calling us out when we try to evade or ignore or rationalize. They're calling us out. They have a word for it, by the way. I'll tell you later. We adults cannot refuse this challenge. The students are speaking from the moral high ground. And we must change or continue to experience a level of violence that is completely unacceptable and unbelievably tragic. We have to hear the message and then be changed ourselves. From a land of violence, they call to us, get us out of here. We, in good conscience and in love, cannot do anything less.